For 50 years, Star Trek has filled TV screens all over the world. With 6 television series and over 500 hours of stories from the final frontier, the immense size of this science fiction franchise is difficult to grasp. However, what if I told you that it could have been a lot larger, and that maybe the franchise could have gone in several different directions, other than the one we know? There have been a number of Star Trek TV show concepts that, thankfully or not, were never developed. In light of the news that the powers that be will grant us another trip to the Star Trek multiverse in 2017, here is a quick rundown of the Trek TV show concepts that never were. A brief disclaimer, this is not quite an exhaustive list. We all know that Star Trek debuted in 1966 under the creative guidance of Gene Roddenberry, a former cop, pilot, and surprising survivor of multiple plane crashes. The show was canceled in 1969, just 3 years later, despite a very energetic fan base. Much of this is known, but did you know that there were several spin-off programs being considered during Star Trek's original run? One concept was a show that involved benevolent aliens helping Earth. Another revolved around a medical starship, and a third series would have centered around a famous intergalactic conman. First, let's deal with the benevolent aliens. The original series episode Assignment Earth doubled as a kind of backdoor pilot for a potential new series. In this original Trek episode, Gary 7, the descendant of some humans kidnapped from Earth in 4000 BCE, is transported to 1968 Earth to save humanity from itself, like some sort of galactic James Bond. With full knowledge by the end of the second season that Star Trek would likely be canceled, Gene Roddenberry, Art Wallace, and others used the opportunity to propose a new series around Gary 7, Interstellar Man of Mystery. When Star Trek was picked up for its third and what would be final season, the Assignment Earth spin-off idea was put aside. Years after Star Trek was canceled, Roddenberry and fellow Trek legend Gene L. Coon turned the idea into a non-Star Trek television movie, The QUESTOR tapes, in 1974. The proposed medical starship spin-off series was to be called HOPESHIP, and it was a project of both Roddenberry and sci-fi author Darlene Hartman. The series was to follow the adventures of a Federation medical ship around the galaxy, and would have possibly included as a permanent character Dr. M'Benga, from the original series episodes A Private Little War and That Which Survives.
This is Dr. M'Benga. There will be someone with you constantly now. When the time comes, I'll be called.
While the HOPESHIP did not make it to TV screens, it did, however, make it into print. In 1994, Darlene Hartman, publishing under the name Simon Lang, included the HOPESHIP concept as part of a series of novels. And perhaps completely by coincidence, we did get to see a working Federation medical starship of sorts. In the Next Generation's final episode, All Good Things, we get to see an alternate future where the USS Pasteur exists, captained by a familiar face.
You asked for an autopsy report. It's only preliminary, but the cause of death seems to have been cellular disruption.
Another interesting idea for an original series spin-off would have followed Harcourt Fenton Mudd, an interstellar conman, also known as Harry.
Welcome aboard, Kirk. Been a long time, eh?
You know Harry Mudd, right?
You know this man, Captain?
Do I know him? Harcourt Fenton Mudd? Thief?
Oh, come now.
Swindler and conman?
Entrepreneur.
Liar and rogue?
Did I leave you with that impression?
He was featured in the original series episodes Mudd's Women and I, Mudd, as well as the animated series episode Mudd's Passion. According to Dan Madsen, writing for Starlog magazine, there was some chatter at NBC about taking the Harry Mudd character, played by Roger C. Carmel, into a Star Trek spin-off series. The concept didn't travel far, and poor Roger only heard about it at a party after the fact, from Gene Roddenberry himself. So even while Star Trek was originally in production, there were several series concepts being considered, each of which would have taken the franchise in incredibly different directions. This period of creativity was not isolated. Other proposals were soon to follow. However, with the cancellation of the show in 1969, the nascent age of Star Trek was over, and the first of 3 Trekless Dark Ages began. In 1973 and 74, Star Trek finally returned to TV screens in the form of the now underappreciated Star Trek the Animated Series. This spin-off had, on several levels, more creative freedom than the original live-action series. Not only did the animated series keep the idea of Star Trek alive on television as it was intended, but it also resulted in Star Trek's first ever Emmy win, among other awards, for the episode How Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth, written by Russell Bates and David Wise.
Of course, the elasticity of the force field can respond in only one direction at a time.
As the animated series was itself just as experimental as the original, it is important to note that this first spin-off series set the tone for what was allowable in future Star Trek shows. The animated series ran for 2 seasons and constituted a little recovery age, after which Star Trek entered its second, longer Dark Age. In 1976 and 77, Paramount Pictures began working on bringing back live-action Trek, first in terms of a motion picture, Star Trek Planet of the Titans, which was abandoned, then in the form of Star Trek II, or rather, Star Trek Phase II. This new TV show would have chronicled a second 5-year mission under James Kirk and would have featured a mix of old and new faces. While the show never made it to TV screens, several concepts from the Phase II project did make it into future Trek in various forms. Plot points, a total of 2 scripts, and even the concept of using Star Trek to launch a new television network would reappear later with The Next Generation and Voyager. Pre-production on Phase 2 was fairly extensive. A 2-hour pilot and 13 episodes were initially ordered, but it proved tough to sell this new series and the effort stalled. Then, in 1977, a wild sci-fi franchise appeared. And the decision was made to move Star Trek into feature film territory. Star Trek the Motion Picture was born out of many recycled elements from Phase 2, including the film's very script, which was the Phase 2 pilot. The motion picture was released in 1979, and the dream of returning Trek to the small screen was put on hold.
Viewer off. Viewer off.
Star Trek flourished as a successful film franchise for much of the 1980s, and appetite for Trek continued to expand. Approaching the 20th anniversary of the original series, new ideas for TV shows began to surface as interest in returning Star Trek to the small screen reached an apogee.
You will tell me the secret of the Genesis torpedo.
I have no knowledge.
In lieu of Roddenberry's participation, Greg Strangis, a writer-producer for the show Falcon Crest, was given the task of creating a new Star Trek show. Strangis' concept was very much like a film idea pitched by legendary Trek producer Harve Bennett a few years earlier, Star Trek: The Academy Years. Despite Roddenberry's initial reluctance to get involved in the miserably hard work that is a television show, he and the studio did reach an agreement on his participation. With that, Star Trek The Next Generation was born, and Star Trek's second Dark Age was over. While it took a few years for The Next Generation to find its groove, its eventual success was a huge boost of confidence to the television arm of Star Trek, and the powers that be mused over the possibility of other Star Trek spin-offs. Several ideas were suggested during the late 80s and early 90s, including a series set aboard a space station, a Next Generation prequel, and some sort of series revolving around the Klingon Empire. When approached to play an advisory role for the newly launching Sci-Fi Channel, Roddenberry even briefly considered a Star Trek sitcom starring none other than Lwaxana Troi.
You didn't tell me that you and Captain Picard were...
You said you didn't want to hear about my other romances. I have a new love, Jean-Luc. And you can't keep killing all my lovers now. That simply has to stop.
Killing?
Oh, he's insanely jealous.
Listen, Tom. I must possess Lwaxana, and if that means destroying your ship in the process, so be it.
That's right. Sitcom. Thankfully, they produced Deep Space Nine instead. It was also during this time that a second animated series idea was floated. The show would have involved both original series and Next Generation characters in a crossover cast. However, networks were not interested. It's unclear how much work was done on this idea. A few years later, the Next Generation finished its 7-year run. Deep Space Nine had found its place as the successful black sheep of the Trek franchise, and Voyager had been given the green light. Star Trek was in the middle of its own small-screen golden age. Other ideas for spin-offs continued to pop up while DS9 and Voyager were on the air. Armin Shimmerman, the actor who played the most famous bartender in Trek history, was involved in a proposal for an animated Ferengi series that would have followed Quark and Rom around as teenagers.
I don't know. Come on. Aren't you just a little bit curious?
Meanwhile, fans clamored for a Captain Sulu TV series, which would have been a bold new direction for a Trek spin-off.
There's a sense of loyalty to the men and women you serve with. A sense of family.
Just before Enterprise left TV screens for good, veteran sci-fi author and Star Trek writer Jimmy Diggs made a proposal for another animated series using CGI, which would have followed Captain Sulu in the Enterprise B in their attempt to stop an invasion of Federation space. Mr. Diggs' idea was called Star Trek: Lions of the Night. Several conceptual sketches were produced, but the idea did not leave space dock. In 2001, Star Trek Voyager completed its 7-year run, and Enterprise finished in 2005 after only 4 years on TV. For the first time in 18 years, there was no new Star Trek being broadcast on television. The Golden Age had drawn to a close, and Star Trek's third Dark Age had begun. From now on, all TV series suggestions would be geared toward resurrecting the Trek franchise on the small screen. During this third Dark Age, 2 famous Trek actors thought they had just the thing to carry the Trek torch into the future. William Shatner came forward with an idea for a concept summarized as Star Trek: The Academy. This concept was similar to earlier proposals by both Harve Bennett and Greg Stranges. Shatner's version of this idea, conceptualized along with Judith and Garfield Reeves-Stevens, would visit a young Kirk and Spock, played again by fresh faces, as they meet for the first time, pre-Starfleet. The idea was shot down. In an interview just a few years ago, Jonathan Frakes mentioned a proposal he brought to the studio, presumably a TV show chronicling the Rikers aboard the USS Titan that takes place after Star Trek Nemesis. This idea was also shot down pretty quickly. The studio likely felt that franchise fatigue was high so soon after Enterprise left the air. Perhaps the Star Trek market really was too saturated to support a new series. However, at least 2 gentlemen were convinced that what Star Trek needed was a fresh reboot. Bryan Singer, a film director who made an appearance in Star Trek Nemesis as a tactical officer, came forward with an idea called Star Trek Federation. Set in the 30th century, this series concept featured a weakened, older Federation. Klingons who had drifted away from their warrior culture, Vulcans and Romulans who were actively pursuing reunification, and the first Starship Enterprise in 300 years. While not quite a reboot, and not quite an official submission to the studio, Singer's concept very much had the spirit of a fresh start. And then there's J. Michael Straczynski's series proposal, which, unlike Singer's concept, really was a complete reboot of the franchise. Straczynski is famous for Babylon 5, a spectacular space station-based sci-fi series that played on the small screen alongside DS9 in the 1990s. Straczynski envisioned a complete and total jettison of all previous Trek, except for the core original characters. This would have been a serialized, character-driven, hard sci-fi concept, updated for modern audiences right down to the technology used. Interestingly, this concept series would have existed in a second universe, labeled as Universe B, so that previous Trek content, Universe A, would not be officially erased in canon. In 2006, yet another idea for an animated series materialized in order to keep the Trek flame lit: Star Trek Final Frontier. Taking place in the 26th century, this new animated series was to chronicle the adventures of a Captain Chase and his crew as they attempt to reignite a sense of exploration in a Federation ruined by time and war. The proposal was conceived by veteran Trek producer David Rossi, who had been on board since The Next Generation. It is a shame this series didn't get the green light, because the concept sketches and the ideas behind them are very compelling. In fact, new conceptual material is still being produced over at the team's website. You should check it out via the link in the subspace below. The Star Trek franchise appears to be a constant source of new ideas. Even with the new J.J. Abrams movies out, and the newest movie, Star Trek Beyond, ready to release in 2016, series proposals continue to surface. Roberto Orci and Alex Kurtzman, writers for this latest round of Trek films, briefly proposed yet another Trek animated series. Also, Michael Dorn, aka Worf, is currently making the case to return to the 24th century with a starship under the command of a Captain Worf, a series idea as bold as the previous Captain Sulu idea. It seems that the longer the franchise lives, the more conservative series proposals become. Interested parties either want to bring back particular established characters or just reboot everything completely in order to get away from the trappings of an established universe. The J.J. Abrams movies, you'll note, borrow from the reboot camp of ideas in the form of Straczynski's Universe B concept, a smart way to save face with fans. The 2009 Trek film even had a superficial suggestion of the infamous Bennett-Strangis-Shatner Academy Years concept, a kind of do-over idea that keeps popping up. The real innovation among all these ideas is perhaps Bryan Singer's Star Trek Federation concept, as well as several of the animated series ideas. And now, we have a new series to look forward to in 2017. It seems that the third dark age of Trek is finally drawing to a close. Thank you for watching. Please feel free to leave a comment in the subspace below and click on over to Patreon to support the channel. And if you are interested in learning about non-Trek topics, then may I suggest Curio, a brand new channel that we've created. Think of it like a coffee table book in video form. Thank you.